The air at the St. Landry Parish slave auction of 1848 was thick with the stench of desperation and cheap whiskey. Men with dead eyes and rotting teeth appraised human flesh with the casual indifference of butchers inspecting cattle. On the auction block, under the oppressive Louisiana sun, stood a figure who seemed to defy reality itself. She was a woman, but of a scale that silenced the rowdy crowd. Nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a draft horse and hands that could likely crush a skull as easily as a rotted fruit. Her name, the auctioneer barked, was Anya. He spoke of her strength, her endurance, but his voice lacked conviction. He started the bidding at $500, a fortune for a field hand, but a pittance for a giant. Not a single hand was raised. The price dropped. 400, 3. The crowd began to murmur, shifting uneasily. They knew the stories that clung to this woman like the swamp mist. The auctioneer's face glistened with sweat as the price plummeted past 100, then 50, then 10. It was unheard of. He was practically giving her away. Finally, in a fit of exasperated rage, he shouted a price that was both an insult and a plea. $1 for the giantess from the Duval plantation. Silence. Then a final, desperate cry. 5 cents. Does anyone bid a nickel for this creature? From the back of the crowd, a single manicured hand went up. Elias Thorne, owner of the Blackwood sugar plantation, stepped forward. A cruel smile played on his lips as he tossed a nickel onto the stage. The coin spun, catching the sunlight before settling in the dust. The sale was made. But as Thorne led his impossible bargain away, he failed to notice the looks on the faces of the other planters. Not envy, but a cold, chilling pity. They weren't looking at the giant woman with fear. They were looking at him. Blackwood Manor was not a home. It was a monument to human misery, carved from the Louisiana swamp. 2,000 acres of sugarcane radiated out from a monstrous Gothic Revival mansion that seemed to rot under the perpetual humidity. The air was heavy, smelling of burnt sugar and decay. This was the kingdom Elias Thorne had built, and he ruled it with a blend of scientific calculation and casual brutality. When he arrived with Anya in tow, the other slaves working the field stopped dead, their hose frozen in midair. They had seen tall men and strong women, but they had never seen a human being of this magnitude. She moved with a strange, almost mechanical grace, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the horizon. There was no fear in her gaze, no defiance, nothing. It was a terrifying emptiness, a void that seemed to swallow the light around it. Thorne shoved her toward a row of cabins, a smug look of triumph on his face. He was a student of what he called human husbandry, a perverse application of agricultural breeding principles to his enslaved workforce. He believed he could create a stronger, more docile generation of laborers. In Anya, he saw not a person but a foundation, a broodmare of unparalleled potential. Her size and strength would be passed to her offspring, creating a lineage of giants to toil in his fields. He believed he had just committed the greatest act of business acumen in his life. He had purchased the key to his dynasty for the price of a piece of candy. But as the slaves watched Anya being led to an isolated cabin at the edge of the property, they exchanged silent, knowing glances. They had heard the whispers that traveled on the wind from the Duval plantation, tales of blood and an unspeakable horror. Thorne saw a bargain. They saw a curse, walking on 2 legs. Later that afternoon, Elias Thorne conducted his private inspection. Inside the stifling heat of a dusty barn, he ordered Anya to stand before him. He circled her like a predator, his eyes taking in every detail of her physique. Her muscles were corded and powerful, her bone structure immense. He was a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, to find their breaking points, their fears. But with Anya, he found nothing to grasp. Her face was a placid mask. To test her, he committed an act of casual cruelty. He took a blacksmith's pin from a nearby table and jabbed it deep into the muscle of her forearm. He expected a cry, a flinch, a gasp, any reaction to the pain. He got nothing. Anya did not even blink. She simply looked down at the pin protruding from her arm as if it were a curious insect that had landed there. Then slowly, her eyes rose to meet his. The emptiness was still there, but Thorne felt a flicker of something else behind it, something ancient and cold. He pulled the pin out, a trickle of blood following it. She still did not react. He pushed on her, prodded her, felt her limbs. She was a statue of flesh and blood, a vessel of immense power with no apparent soul inside. He dismissed the rumors instantly. This was not a monster, this was a broken thing. An animal so traumatized it had retreated from the world. Her spirit was already crushed, making her the perfect subject for his experiments. He wouldn't have to break her will because she no longer had won. He left the barn more convinced than ever of his genius. He hadn't just bought a slave for 5 cents. He had bought a blank slate, a creature of pure physical potential, unburdened by the troublesome complexities of a human mind. He failed to consider that a slate that appears blank is not always empty. Sometimes, the writing is simply hidden, waiting for the right moment to reveal a message of pure terror. That evening, as Thorne sat in his study congratulating himself, there was a quiet knock on the door. It was Hattie, the elderly woman who ran the household slaves. She had served Thorne's father before him and was one of the few people who dared to speak to him with anything approaching honesty. Her face, a roadmap of wrinkles and sorrow, was etched with genuine fear. She told him that the other slaves were terrified of the new woman. They refused to go near her cabin. Thorne scoffed, but Hattie pressed on, her voice dropping to a whisper. She told him what she had heard from a cousin who worked as a cook for a neighbor of the Duvals. The story was not just a rumor. It was a ghost story told to frighten children and warn adults. The Duval family, Monsieur Duval, his wife, and their 2 grown sons, had not died of a fever. They had been found in their beds one morning, torn to pieces. The official report said it was a bear attack, that a rogue animal had somehow gotten into the locked house. But the slaves knew better. They knew that the only other person in the house that night had been Anya. They said the parish sheriff found her sitting in a rocking chair in the main hall, her simple dress soaked in blood that was not her own. She was rocking back and forth, humming a tune with no melody, completely silent. When they asked what happened, she just stared right through them. Monsieur Duval's brother, consumed by grief and terror, couldn't bring himself to kill her. He couldn't prove she'd done it. So he sold her for the first and only bid he received, a single nickel, just to remove her presence from his land. He had sold a demon for 5 cents, Hattie whispered, and now that demon slept at Blackwood. Elias Thorne was not a man to be swayed by ghost stories. He considered fear a tool for the weak, a sentiment to be exploited in others, never harbored in himself. Hattie's warning did not frighten him. It angered him. He saw it as an attempt by his slaves to manipulate him, to project their own primitive superstitions onto his new, valuable asset. That night, fueled by brandy and a defiant rage, he decided he would put an end to the whispers. He would assert his ownership in the most absolute terms. Taking a heavy iron key from his study, he walked through the humid darkness toward the isolated cabin where Anya was kept. The cicadas buzzed, their drone a nervous hum in the oppressive silence. When he reached the door, he paused. There was no light within, no sound of movement. It was like a tomb. For the first time, a sliver of doubt entered his mind. What if the stories were true? He shook the thought away. He was Elias Thorne. This creature, whatever she was, belonged to him. He was the master here. He unbolted the door and stepped inside, pulling it shut behind him. The small room was pitch black. He could smell the packed earth floor, the sweat on his own skin, and something else, a complete and total absence of fear. He felt for her in the darkness, his hand landing on a massive, unyielding shoulder. She was sitting perfectly still on the straw pallet. He could hear her breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that was unnervingly calm. She wasn't scared of him. In that moment he felt a profound, primal terror that he had never known, but his pride was a stronger force. He was the master. He would prove it. He turned the key in the lock, the heavy thunk of the bolt echoing in the claustrophobic space. The sun rose the next morning, burning the mist off the sugarcane fields. The slaves went to their work with a heavy sense of dread, their eyes repeatedly drawn to the locked cabin at the edge of the property. Just after dawn, the door finally opened. Elias Thorne emerged, stumbling into the morning light. He looked like a man who had wrestled with a demon and lost. His fine silk shirt was torn, his face was pale and slick with sweat, and he was cradling his right hand. It was a mangled ruin of flesh and bone, the fingers bent at unnatural angles, clearly shattered. He saw Hattie watching him from the steps of the main house, her expression a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction. "I slipped on the steps," Thorne stammered, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The dew made them slick." It was a pathetic lie, and both of them knew it. No fall from a cabin stoop could inflict such a specific, devastating injury. It looked as if his hand had been caught in a piece of industrial machinery. He ordered Hattie to fetch him laudanum and bandages, then locked himself in his study, refusing to see anyone. He never spoke of what happened inside that cabin. He never again went to Anya at night. The balance of power at Blackwood had shifted. Thorne still owned the giant woman's body, but he now understood that he had no claim on her will, her mind, or whatever cold, alien force resided within her. He had gone into that room to prove he was a master, but he had emerged a jailer, and a terrified one at that. He finally understood the horrible truth behind her 5-cent price. Anya was not broken. She was unbreakable, and what she was capable of was a nightmare he had only just begun to comprehend. A palpable sense of dread descended upon Blackwood Manor. The plantation, which had always been a place of misery, now became a place of active, watchful terror. The change was most evident in its master. Elias Thorne, once a man of swaggering, confident cruelty, became a phantom in his own home. He drank heavily, his eyes constantly darting toward the windows as if expecting some horror to emerge from the sugar cane. He put a heavy padlock on Anya's cabin and ordered that she be left completely alone. Food was left at her door, but no one ever saw her take it. The most unsettling events began to happen at night. A prize bull was found in its pen one morning, its massive neck snapped cleanly, as if by an impossible force. A week later, 2 of the overseer's hounds were discovered in the same state, their bodies twisted but with no marks on them. The overseer, a brutal man named Marcus, was convinced Anya was somehow responsible. He saw the way the other slaves gave her cabin a wide berth, whispering prayers as they passed. He urged Thorne to let him handle the situation, to let him use the whip, the brand, the methods that had broken every other defiant slave. But Thorne, remembering the feeling of his bones grinding into powder in an unyielding grip, refused. His fear was now greater than his authority. He told Marcus to leave her be, that she was contained. But Marcus saw the truth in his master's haunted eyes. Anya was not contained. She was waiting. The entire plantation was holding its breath, caught in the unnerving calm before a storm that everyone knew was coming. The whispers of the Duval massacre no longer felt like a distant ghost story. They felt like a prophecy, waiting to be fulfilled. Unable to bear the psychological torment, Thorne did something he had never done before. He sought outside help. But he couldn't call the local parish doctor. The story would be all over Louisiana within a day. Instead, he sent a trusted courier to New Orleans with a large sum of cash and a letter for a discreet, morally flexible physician named Dr. Alastair Finch. Finch was a man of science, but also a man who understood that some secrets were worth paying for. He arrived at Blackwood under the cover of darkness, a small, bird-like man with piercingly intelligent eyes. Thorne explained the situation, describing Anya's immense strength and most unnervingly her complete indifference to injury. Dr. Finch, intrigued, agreed to examine her. The examination was a tense, surreal affair. Finch, escorted by Thorne and a reluctant Marcus, entered the cabin. Anya sat on her pallet, watching them with that same unnerving placidity. Finch conducted his tests, pricking her with needles, applying pressure, even using a small, heated piece of metal. Her body registered no response. She did not flinch, did not cry out, did not even seem to notice. After a long, silent hour, Finch emerged from the cabin, his face pale. Back in Thorne's study, he delivered a diagnosis that was far more terrifying than any supernatural curse. "This is not a psychological condition, Monsieur Thorne," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It is a profound physiological abnormality. I have only read about it in obscure European medical journals. It's called congenital insensitivity to pain." He explained that Anya's nervous system did not transmit pain signals to her brain. She could feel pressure, could feel touch, but the agony that stops a normal person from pushing their body past its limits was completely absent. She has no concept of her own strength, Finch warned, his eyes wide with a scientist's terror. She does not know what it feels like to break a bone because she cannot feel her own. She is, in essence, a human being without limits. A person like that is not a slave. She is the most dangerous animal on this earth. Dr. Finch's diagnosis should have been a final warning, a clear sign for Elias Thorne to rid himself of Anya, to sell her for nothing, to give her away, to do anything to remove this limitless danger from his life. But Thorne's mind was a poisoned swamp of greed and obsession. He heard the doctor's words, but what he processed was something else entirely. A human being without limits. A creature that could work without tiring, endure without complaint, and most importantly, breed children who might inherit these same impossible traits. His fear was real, but his avarice was a cancer that had consumed his soul. The potential to create a dynasty of super slaves, an army of giants who did not feel pain, was a temptation he could not resist. He paid Dr. Finch a handsome sum for his silence and continued his perverse experiment. He began providing Anya with better food, treating her not as a human but as prized livestock. And as the months passed, his gamble appeared to pay off. Anya became pregnant. The pregnancy was as unnerving as everything else about her. She showed no discomfort, her massive frame carrying the child with an eerie, mechanical efficiency. When the time came, Hattie was sent to the cabin to act as midwife. She later told the other slaves that it was the most terrifying birth she had ever witnessed. There were no screams, no cries of agony, no pleading. Anya delivered the child in absolute, profound silence, her expression unchanging. She simply stared at the cabin's ceiling beams as she brought new life into the world. The baby was a girl, large and healthy, with her mother's powerful frame already evident in her long limbs. Thorne was ecstatic. He named the child Ilara. He had his heir, the first of his new, improved line. He believed he had finally bent the monster to his will, forcing her to serve his grand design. He did not realize he had not created an heir. He had just allowed the monster to replicate herself. Motherhood did not soften Anya. It made her more dangerous. She was fiercely, terrifyingly protective of the infant Ilara, but her maternal instincts were alien and unsettling. She did not coo or sing to the child. She did not smile. Instead, she would sit for hours on her pallet, holding the baby against her chest and watching the doorway of the cabin with an unblinking, predatory focus. Her silence, once empty, now seemed charged with a singular protective purpose. Anyone who came near the cabin, even Hattie bringing food, was met with a low, almost subsonic growl that vibrated in the chest and turned the blood to ice. Thorne himself dared not enter. He would stand at a distance, observing his creation with a mix of pride and primal fear. The most chilling demonstration of Anya's nature happened one sweltering afternoon. Hattie was leaving a bucket of water near the cabin door when she saw a cottonmouth snake, thick as a man's wrist, slither through a crack in the wall, heading directly for the sleeping infant. Hattie screamed a warning, but it was too late. Before she could even move, Anya's hand shot out like a bolt of lightning. She didn't grab the snake in the middle. She grabbed it directly behind its head. There was no struggle, no sound. Her immense fingers simply closed. The snake's spine snapped with a sound like dry twigs breaking. Then, with a methodical, dispassionate intensity, she squeezed. Hattie watched in silent horror as Anya's hand compressed the snake's head into a bloody, unrecognizable pulp, its fangs and venom sacs crushed into nothing. Anya then wiped her hand on the dirt floor, her expression as placid and unconcerned as if she had just swatted a fly. She turned her gaze back to Hattie, her eyes holding a silent, unmistakable message. Anything that threatens my child will be unmade. Elias Thorne's obsession with his breeding program forced him to travel, seeking out other planters and physicians who dabbled in the dark arts of eugenics, always speaking in hypotheticals and abstracts. During one such trip to Charleston, the day-to-day running of Blackwood fell entirely to his overseer, Marcus. Marcus was a man carved from hate and ignorance, whose only solution to any problem was the application of brute force. He despised Anya, not just for the fear she inspired, but because her very existence was an affront to his authority. He saw Thorne's terror as weakness, and believed the master had allowed a dangerous animal to run wild. With Thorne gone, Marcus decided he would finally succeed where his master had failed. He would break the silent giant. He would prove that every creature, no matter how powerful, could be taught to fear the whip. He gathered 2 other overseers, arming them with heavy leather bullwhips. They approached Anya's cabin, a tangible wave of malice rolling before them. Anya was outside, in the small, fenced-in yard Thorne had built for her, with Alara playing in the dirt at her feet. Marcus unlocked the gate, a cruel sneer on his face. "It's time you learned some respect, beast," he spat, cracking the whip in the air. Anya slowly rose to her full height, placing herself between the men and her daughter. She made no sound. Her face remained a placid, unreadable mask. This enraged Marcus even more. He wanted a reaction. He wanted fear. He swung the whip with all his might, the leather biting deep into the flesh of her back. The whip left a bloody welt, but Anya did not flinch. She didn't even seem to register the blow. Instead, she turned her head very slowly until her cold, empty eyes locked directly onto his. In that moment, Marcus saw something that was not animal or human. It was an abyss, a void of pure, silent consequence. But his pride was already committed. He couldn't back down now, not in front of his men. He raised the whip high for a second, fatal strike. When Elias Thorne returned from Charleston 2 days later, he was met not by his overseer but by a delegation of terrified slaves led by Hattie. They told him Marcus was gone. So were the other 2 men he had taken with him. They had last been seen heading toward Anya's cabin. Thorne's blood ran cold. He grabbed a rifle from his study, and against every instinct screaming at him to flee, he went to investigate. The scene he found would be seared into his nightmares for the rest of his life. The fenced-in yard around Anya's cabin was undisturbed. Anya herself sat on the steps, calmly braiding her daughter's hair. She looked up at Thorne's approach, her expression as placid as ever. But a few yards away, near the sugarcane fields, lay the source of the slaves' terror. Marcus and his men were there, or what was left of them. Their bodies were not just broken, they were fundamentally rearranged. Limbs were twisted into impossible angles, spines snapped, skulls caved in with a force that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It was not the work of a whip or a knife. It was the work of pure, limitless strength, applied with a methodical, dispassionate precision. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood on Anya or in the yard. It was a silent, clean execution. Thorne knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Anya was responsible, but he had no proof. There were no witnesses who would speak. He was the master of Blackwood Manor, and yet he was utterly powerless. He had created a monster he could not control, and that monster had just demonstrated in the most brutal way imaginable that his authority meant nothing. Fear no longer just gripped Blackwood. It now ruled with an iron, silent fist. The deaths of the overseers marked a profound turning point. The pretense of mastery was over. Elias Thorne was now a prisoner in his own kingdom, and Anya was its silent, watchful queen. His obsession, however, was a sickness that defied logic. Even in his terror, his greed-fueled dream of a dynasty persisted. Over the next decade, Anya gave birth 4 more times. Each time it was a daughter. Each time the birth was conducted in that same, terrifying silence. And each of the 5 daughters, Alara, Maeve, Saren, Lyra, and Cora, grew with an unnatural speed, inheriting their mother's towering height and her chilling, congenital insensitivity to pain. Thorne watched them grow, a captive audience to his own unfolding nightmare. They were magnificent and terrifying creatures. By the time Alara, the eldest, was 12, she was already nearly 6 feet tall. They moved with a synchronized, silent grace, a tribe of young giantesses who seemed to share a single mind. They felt no pain, which meant they had no fear. They would sustain gruesome injuries in the fields, deep gashes, broken fingers, and simply continue their work, their faces betraying no emotion, only a quiet, unnerving focus. The other slaves avoided them, viewing them with a mixture of awe and superstitious dread. They were the no-pain children, a separate and feared race living within the plantation. Thorne tried to separate them to break their bond, but it was useless. They were more than just sisters. They were a single organism, a pack that moved and thought as one. He was no longer a breeder. He was a zookeeper, tending to a cage of predators that grew larger and more intelligent with each passing year, all while knowing that the bars of the cage were an illusion that could vanish at any moment. Thorne's descent into paranoia accelerated when he discovered their language. It wasn't spoken. It was something far more subtle and unnerving. He was watching them from his study window one afternoon as they worked in a distant field. He noticed their hands moving in a series of complex, rhythmic taps against the wooden handles of their hoes. Tap, 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 tap. It was a pattern, intricate and deliberate. He then saw Ilara, the eldest, respond with a different sequence of taps. It was a conversation, a silent, percussive language that was completely unintelligible to him, a secret code clicking back and forth across the fields. He began to watch them obsessively, realizing they used it constantly. A soft tapping of fingers on a table, the rhythmic scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the sound of their bare feet on the wooden porch. It was all communication. A constant flowing stream of information passed between them, a language of pure rhythm that he could hear but never understand. The realization was horrifying. He was surrounded by a family of giants who could plot, plan, and conspire right in front of him, and he would be deaf to it all. He was no longer just a jailer. He was an outsider, an alien species in a world of his own making. He would lie awake at night in his four-poster bed, listening. He could hear the house settling, the wind in the trees, and beneath it all, the faint, rhythmic tapping from the cabins. Tap, 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 tap. It was the sound of his own irrelevance, the sound of his power bleeding away into the darkness. He had wanted to create a new generation of slaves. Instead, he had bred his own replacements, and they were speaking a language that foretold Section 15. The story of Blackwood Manor is a tale told in whispers, but its most terrifying chapter was written in silence, in the spidery, ink-blotted script of Elias Thorne's private journal. Discovered years later, walled up behind a fireplace, the leather-bound book reveals a mind slowly coming apart. The entries, at first confident and boastful, descend into a paranoid scrawl. October 12, 1859, one entry reads, "I saw Ilara watching me from the fields today. Not with a slave's deference, but with a cold, analytical curiosity, like a scientist observing an insect. It is the same look her mother has. I feel evaluated." The journal becomes a catalog of his terror. He documented their silent language of taps, convinced they were discussing his every move. He noted how they never seemed to sleep at the same time, always leaving one of them on watch. He recorded his attempts to understand their condition, writing of their complete lack of empathy, their inability to comprehend the suffering of others because they had no physical frame of reference for it. Pain, to them, was an abstract concept, like a color to a blind man. December 3, 1860, he wrote, his handwriting becoming jagged and desperate. "My experiment was a success, but not in the way I intended. I sought to breed a better animal, but I have created a new kind of human. A human without the very thing that makes us cautious, makes us civil, makes us fear God. They are apex predators, and I have locked myself in the cage with them. It is not I who is studying them. It is they who are studying me." The journal reveals the ultimate horror of his situation. Elias Thorne, the master, the architect of this dynasty of giants, had realized he was nothing more than a specimen in their experiment, the lone, fragile mouse in a cage full of silent, patient cats. By 1861, with the nation teetering on the brink of civil war, Thorne's grand ambition had curdled into a desperate desire to simply survive. His fortune was dwindling, the plantation running on fear and inertia. He made one last, frantic attempt to regain control. He would sell them. He would break up the family, sever the bond, and rid himself of the source of his terror. He arranged a private sale with a notoriously ruthless slave trader from Natchez, a man who prided himself on being able to handle any merchandise. Thorne offered him Anya and the eldest daughter, Alara, for a fraction of their theoretical value. The trader arrived, a big, blustering man with pistols in his belt. He laughed at Thorne's obvious fear, boasting that no slave was a match for him. He entered the yard to inspect the goods. Anya and Alara stood side by side, two silent, towering figures of immense power. The trader walked around them, prodding them, insulting them, trying to provoke a reaction. He received nothing but that cold, empty stare. As he turned to leave, Alara, now a full-grown woman of 17, reached out a hand. She didn't grab him. She simply laid her massive palm flat against his chest. It was not a violent gesture, but the man's face went white. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, a look of pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes. He had felt it, the obscene, limitless power held in reserve, the casual promise of annihilation. He left without another word, forfeiting his deposit and riding away from Blackwood as if the hounds of hell were at his heels. The message was clear. They could not be sold. They could not be contained. The curse of Blackwood Manor was not a superstition. It was a physical reality, and Elias Thorne was chained to it for the rest of his miserable life. The final, bloody turning point came during a sweltering summer evening in 1862. Thorne, desperate for some semblance of his former life, had invited a handful of local planters for a night of poker and whiskey. Among them was a young, arrogant Creole heir named Jean-Luc Devereaux, known for his cruelty and his entitled advances on enslaved women. Drunk on Thorne's brandy, Devereaux cornered Alara in a hallway as she was clearing the dishes. He made a lewd comment, grabbing her arm. The other slaves who witnessed the moment froze in terror, expecting an explosion of violence. But Alara did not explode. She simply stopped, turning to look at the hand on her arm, then up at Devereaux's face, her expression one of mild, scientific curiosity. She made no sound. She did not pull away. She simply held his gaze. Devereaux, unnerved by her lack of fear, let go and laughed it off, stumbling back to the card game. An hour later, he announced he was leaving. He walked out the front door and down the grand, sweeping staircase of the manor's entrance. No one saw what happened next, but a moment later, a sickening crunch echoed through the night, followed by a brief, gurgling scream that was cut short. They found Jean-Luc Devereaux at the bottom of the stone steps, his neck broken, his head turned completely around to face his back. It was officially ruled a tragic drunken accident, a misstep in the dark. But every person at Blackwood, from Thorne down to the youngest child, knew the truth. There was no misstep. There was only a silent, methodical execution. Alara had asserted the family's dominance, demonstrating that the space around them was sacred, and the penalty for trespassing was a swift, silent, and brutal death. What Elias Thorne had created was a force of nature he could no longer pretend to command. He was a keeper, not a master, the warden of a prison where the inmates held all the power. And it forces us to ask a chilling question. Was Thorne's horror at Blackwood an isolated case, a single man's monstrous ambition gone awry? Or was it merely a more extreme version of a systemic evil, a grotesque symptom of a society built on the fantasy of owning human souls? Let us know in the comments what you think. Was this a unique nightmare, or a glimpse into the hidden, logical endpoint of slavery itself? We see so many new faces here in our community, and we'd love to know what state or country you're watching from. Now, let's return to the suffocating darkness of Blackwood Manor, where a silent family of giants was about to escalate their cold war into a final, bloody reckoning. Thorne's desperate attempt to reassert his authority would have devastating consequences, pushing his creations to reveal the true, terrifying extent of their calculated patience. The accident on the stairs was not just a warning. It was a declaration of intent. It was the first move in a final, silent game of checkmate, and Thorne was just beginning to realize he had been playing against grandmasters all along. The death of Jean-Luc Devereaux was a private message to Elias Thorne. The event that followed was a public execution. Thorne's entire fortune, his power, his very identity, was tied to the Blackwood sugar mill. It was a massive brick and timber beast that ran day and night during the harvest, its smokestacks belching the sweet, sickening smell of processed cane into the humid air. One moonless night, 3 months after Devereux's accident, a fire started in the mill's boiler room. It was no accident. The fire spread with an unnatural speed and ferocity, suggesting an accelerant had been used. By the time the alarm was raised, the mill was an inferno, a raging orange monster devouring Thorne's legacy. The slaves formed a bucket brigade, a useless gesture against the roaring blaze. Thorne stood on the lawn of his mansion, his face illuminated by the flickering light of his own ruin, his expression a mask of numb disbelief. As he watched his empire turn to ash, he saw them. Anya and her 5 daughters standing in a silent, perfectly straight line at the edge of the fields. They weren't participating in the futile effort to fight the fire. They were simply watching it, their faces as placid and unreadable as stone monuments. There was no pleasure in their eyes, no triumph, no emotion at all. They were observing the destruction with the same detached, scientific curiosity with which they observed everything else. In that moment, Thorne understood. This was not a random act of rebellion. It was a strategic move. They hadn't just killed a man who had threatened them. They had destroyed the very engine of their enslavement. They were systematically dismantling his world, piece by horrifying piece. The fire broke something in the other slaves. For years, they had feared Anya and her children, viewing them as supernatural oddities, a curse to be avoided. But now they saw something else. They saw power. They saw an effective, terrifying resistance against the man who owned them all. The shift was embodied by Hattie, the old house slave. Hattie had spent a lifetime navigating the brutal politics of survival, her deference a carefully constructed mask. She had warned Thorne years ago, not just out of fear, but out of a deep-seated hatred for him and the system he represented. In Anya's silent, unfeeling lineage, Hattie finally saw a weapon. She began to act. Her assistance was subtle, almost invisible. A misplaced set of keys that gave Anya's daughters access to the smokehouse. A quiet word about which of Thorne's men were the most loyal and which were the most likely to break. She started leaving tools, a sharpening stone, a discarded file, a coil of rope near the places where the daughters worked. She never spoke to them directly about her purpose. She didn't need to. She would leave the items and the next day they would be gone. It was a silent, unspoken alliance, a conspiracy forged in the shared shadow of Thorne's tyranny. Hattie understood what Thorne, in his arrogance, had never considered. Anya's condition wasn't a curse to be endured. In the context of the brutal world they inhabited, it was a gift. It was a shield. It was the perfect armor for a war that had been raging in silence for generations. Elias Thorne was a man unmade. His fortune was gone, his authority was a joke, and his mind was a ragged ruin, haunted by the constant, rhythmic tapping he heard from every corner of his crumbling world. The final thread of his sanity snapped on a cold winter night when he found one of his own journal pages left on his pillow, a page detailing his deepest fears about Anya. A single, bloody fingerprint was pressed into the corner of the paper. They had been in his room. They had read his thoughts. They were showing him that no lock, no door could protect him. He was no longer a master or even a jailer. He was prey, and his predators were simply deciding when to strike. That night, backed into the final corner of his own mind, he made a decision born of absolute desperation. He could not sell them. He could not control them. So he would erase them. He would do what Monsieur Duval's brother had been too cowardly to do. He went to his gun cabinet and took out a heavy, multi-barreled pistol, the kind used for hunting boar. He then retrieved 2 large cans of kerosene from the stables. His plan was simple and brutal. He would go to their cabin, bolt the door from the outside, and burn it to the ground. If any of them managed to escape the flames, he would be waiting with the pistol. It would be a massacre, a bloody, fiery end to his failed experiment. As he walked across the frozen grounds, the kerosene sloshing in the cans, he felt a surge of his old power return. He was Elias Thorne. He would be the master of his own destiny one last time. The night was unnaturally quiet. The usual chorus of insects and frogs from the swamp was silent, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Thorne reached the cabin, a dark, hulking shape against the starlight. He moved with a predator's stealth, placing the kerosene cans gently on the ground. He pulled the heavy iron bolt he had installed years ago, sliding it into place to trap them inside. He was ready. But as his hand touched the rough wood of the door, he felt that something was wrong. There was no sound from within, no breathing, no movement, not even the faint, rhythmic tapping that had become the soundtrack to his madness. A cold dread, more potent than any he had felt before, washed over him. With a trembling hand, he unslung the bolt and pushed the door open. It swung inward on a single, groaning hinge, revealing the interior. The cabin was empty. The straw pallets were bare. They were gone. His eyes darted around the small space, landing on the back wall. As a last resort, years ago, he had installed heavy iron rings and chains, thinking he might one day need to restrain them like animals. The chains were still there, but they were not attached to the wall. They lay in a heap on the dirt floor, the thick iron links not unlocked but bent and snapped, twisted apart by a force that was simply impossible for human hands. He stared at the broken metal, and the full, horrifying truth crashed down upon him. He had not come here tonight as a hunter. He had walked willingly into their trap. Panic is a fire, and in Thorne's mind it was consuming everything. His carefully laid plan had inverted with horrifying speed. He was the one who was trapped, exposed, and outmaneuvered. Driven by a primal need to reclaim control, he did the only thing a cornered tyrant can do. He escalated. He roused the 4 men still loyal to him, hardened, cruel men who worked the mill and served as his enforcers. Armed with rifles, pistols, and lanterns, they formed a posse, a pathetic remnant of his former authority. As they gathered on the lawn, the weather turned. The air grew heavy and thick, and a low, guttural thunder rolled in from the Gulf. A storm was breaking, a violent Louisiana squall that would turn the swamp into a labyrinth of sucking mud and blinding rain. Thorne didn't care. He plunged into the tree line, his men following, the hounds whining and uncertain at their heels. They were hunting in the bayou, a place that had always belonged to the shadows, a place Anya and her daughters knew with an intimacy born of silent observation. The rain came down in sheets, extinguishing their lanterns and turning the world into a chaotic mess of lashing branches and distorted sound. The dogs were useless, circling in confused figures, unable to find a single trace of a scent. It was as if 6 giants had simply vanished from the face of the earth. They pushed deeper, Thorne's desperation overriding all reason, but the feeling was changing. The thrill of the hunt was gone, replaced by a cold, prickling sensation on the back of the neck, the feeling of being watched. They were not alone in the storm, and they were not the ones holding the advantage. The swamp itself became their enemy. What they thought was a desperate escape was, in fact, a meticulously planned military retreat onto favorable ground. The first sign came when the man in front, a brute named Caleb, let out a choked scream. A tripwire, nearly invisible in the gloom, had released a massive, waterlogged cypress log from the canopy above. It swung down like a pendulum of death, missing Caleb's head by inches but shattering his rifle and his shoulder. As they helped him up, they saw the trap's brutal sophistication. This was not a snare for catching game. It was an engine of war built to kill men. Panic began to set in. They moved more slowly now, their eyes scanning the darkness not for their quarry but for the next sign of ambush. A few hundred yards later, they found another. A narrow path between 2 ancient oaks was a lie. Beneath a thin layer of leaves and mud was a deep pit, its bottom lined with the sharpened, broken blades of sugar-cane knives, the very tools of their oppression, now turned into instruments of vengeance. Thorne stared down into the pit, the rain plastering his hair to his skull. He finally understood. The misplaced tools from Hattie. The silent, observant hours the daughters had spent on the edge of the fields. They hadn't been planning an escape. They had been preparing a battlefield. For years, right under his nose, they had been fortifying their territory, turning the bayou into a fortress designed for one purpose, to swallow him and his men whole. They were not fleeing in desperation. They had lured him here to die. The posse's discipline shattered. They were no longer hunters, they were prey, lost in a slaughterhouse of their enemy's own design. A man named Finn, his nerve broken, began firing his pistol wildly into the churning darkness, his screams lost in the roar of the thunder. His panic was infectious. It was in the middle of this chaos that another man, the quietest of the group, simply vanished. He was at the back of the line one moment and gone the next. There was no scream, no cry for help, no sound of a struggle. He was just erased, plucked from the world by a silent, unseen hand. When they realized he was missing, the remaining men became a frantic, terrified mob. They stood back to back, rifles pointed outward, their fear a palpable scent in the rain-soaked air. The hunter had become the hunted. The methodical silence of their attackers was the most terrifying weapon of all. A bear will roar, a wolf will snarl. But Anya and her daughters killed with the quiet efficiency of a falling stone. Thorne screamed their names into the storm, a mixture of rage and pleading. The only answer was the wind and the rain. Then they saw him, the missing man. His body was wedged high in the fork of an oak tree 20 feet off the ground, placed there like a grotesque Christmas ornament. His neck was snapped clean. It was the same silent, brutal signature. It was a message. We are all around you. We are stronger than you. And we can take you whenever we wish. That was the final blow. There was no more fight. There was only flight. The retreat to the manor was a mad, desperate scramble. 2 more men were lost to the swamp, one to a pitfall, another to a silent shape that descended from the trees. Only Thorne and the man with the shattered shoulder, Caleb, made it back, bursting through the front doors of the mansion like men fleeing the gates of hell itself. They bolted the massive oak doors, barred the windows, and collapsed in the grand foyer, their chests heaving, their minds shattered. The role reversal was complete and absolute. The house that had been Thorne's fortress, his symbol of ultimate power and dominion over others, was now his prison. The very walls he had built to keep people in were now the only thing keeping the horrors of the night out. Thorne stumbled to his study, the heart of his former power, and barricaded the door. Caleb was left to whimper in the hallway, armed with a pistol he was too terrified to use. The storm outside began to subside, the thunder receding into a low grumble, the rain softening to a steady drum against the roof. An eerie quiet fell over Blackwood Manor, a silence more terrifying than the storm itself. It was the silence of anticipation, the silence of a predator cornered in its den. And then a new sound began. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, a soft, rhythmic tap on a window pane on the far side of the house. Tap, 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 tap. A moment later, it was answered by another rhythm tapping on the back door, then another on the upstairs windows. Soon, the entire mansion was surrounded by it, a synchronized, percussive chorus. It was their language. They were outside, all of them, and they were talking. The tapping was not an attack. It was a dissection. It started as a simple, coordinated rhythm, a single terrifying heartbeat enclosing the house. But then it began to change. It became a form of psychological torture, flawlessly executed. The rhythms would isolate one room at a time, a sudden frantic volley on the windows of the parlor where Caleb was hiding, driving him to scream and fire his pistol at shadows before falling silent again. Then a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. On the roof directly above Thorne's study, like the sound of a leaky faucet in a madhouse, a rhythm designed to fray the last threads of a man's sanity. They were using the house as an instrument, playing it like a drum. They were mapping it, communicating its weaknesses, and more importantly, they were demonstrating their complete control over the environment. Thorne, huddled behind his desk, realized the true horror of their language. It wasn't just for communication. It was a weapon. They could coordinate an attack with perfect precision in total silence right outside his walls. He and Caleb were not just trapped. They were being studied, their reactions gauged, their psychological defenses systematically dismantled by an enemy that had transcended the need for spoken words. Hours passed like this. The tapping would stop for a long, agonizing stretch, letting the silence breed a false hope, before starting again with a new, maddening rhythm. It was the sound of a clock counting down, the sound of a coffin being nailed shut. Thorne finally understood that he was not going to be killed by a sudden, brutal assault. He was going to be unmade, piece by piece, by a symphony of quiet, patient taps on glass and wood. While Elias Thorne's mind was being methodically taken apart by the sounds from outside, a far quieter and more devastating betrayal was unfolding within. Hattie, the old house slave, the woman who had warned him and then allied herself with his creations, moved through the darkened mansion with the silent purpose of a ghost. She had been waiting for this night for 50 years. She went first to the kitchen, where she unlocked a small, heavy door that led to the root cellar. The door was old, its existence long forgotten by Thorne, but Hattie knew it well. It opened not just into the cellar, but to a collapsed section of an old drainage tunnel that led out into the overgrown gardens, mere feet from the swamp's edge. It was the entry point. The keys she carried jangled softly, the only sound in the house besides Thorne's ragged breathing and Caleb's occasional sob. One by one, she moved through the downstairs, silently unbarring the windows and unbolting the secondary doors that Thorne in his panic had overlooked. She was the ghost in the machine, the silent partner in their deadly calculus. As she finished her work, she heard a new sound, a faint scratching at the cellar door. She opened it. First one, then another, then all 6 of them emerged from the darkness below. Anya and her 5 daughters, their massive frames filling the narrow hallway, moving with an unnatural silence. They were not covered in mud or rain. They were clean, dry, as if they had simply materialized inside the house. They looked at Hattie, and for the first time the old woman saw Ilara's lips curve into something that was not a smile, but a silent acknowledgement. The pact was fulfilled. The predators were inside the walls. The tapping from outside stopped, all at once. The sudden, absolute silence was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. In his study, Thorne felt his heart seize. He knew what it meant. Caleb in the hallway must have known too, because his whimpering ceased, replaced by a choked, gurgling sound, and then nothing. The silence stretched. Thorne aimed his pistol at the study door, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. He heard a floorboard creak in the hall, then another closer. It was a slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy tread. It stopped directly outside his door. He held his breath, his finger tightening on the trigger, waiting for the wood to splinter, for the door to be smashed from its hinges. But that was not their way. Instead, he heard the soft, metallic click of the doorknob turning. Hattie had unlocked it for them. The door swung open slowly, revealing the figure standing there. It was Anya. She filled the doorway, a giant silhouette against the gloom of the hall, her daughters arrayed behind her like a phalanx of vengeful goddesses. She took one step into the room, then another. Thorne screamed at her, a pathetic animal sound, and fired the pistol. The bullet struck her square in the chest. She did not flinch. She did not fall. She simply looked down at the new tear in her dress, then back up at him, her expression unchanged. She took another step forward. Then, after 14 years of absolute silence, she spoke. Her voice was not a woman's voice. It was a low, guttural rasp, the sound of rocks grinding together, of a voice box unused to its purpose. She spoke a single word, his name, Elias. The sound of his name, spoken in that dead, inhuman voice, was the last thing the world would ever hear from Elias Thorne in a way that mattered. The camera of our story does not enter that room. The door swings partially shut, leaving only a sliver of the scene visible. We do not see the final act of violence. We hear it. And what we hear is not the sound of a chaotic, rage-fueled murder. It is the sound of a methodical, dispassionate deconstruction. There is no screaming from Thorne after that first choked gasp. There is only the sickening, wet crack of bones breaking, one by one. The sound of tearing sinew. The heavy, rhythmic thud of an immense weight being brought down again and again and again. It is the sound of a thing being taken apart, not with anger, but with the focused, detached precision of a scientist dissecting a specimen. It is the sound of a body that feels no pain, inflicting a final, absolute lesson about pain upon the man who had built his kingdom upon it. The noises continue for what feels like an eternity, a gruesome symphony of disassembly conducted in near-total darkness. Then it stops. The silence that falls is profound, heavier and more complete than any that has come before. It is the silence of a debt, paid in full. The silence of an experiment concluded. The last thing we hear before the scene fades to black is the soft, metallic clatter of Thorne's shattered pistol falling to the floor. Dawn broke over Blackwood Manor, not with the gentle warmth of a new day, but with the cold, sterile light of a crime scene. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and unnaturally silent. One by one, the cabin doors opened. The slaves emerged, not to the crack of a whip or the clang of a work bell, but to a profound and unsettling quiet. Led by Hattie, they moved as a single body toward the main house. The great oak doors, once a symbol of their imprisonment, now stood ajar, an open invitation. Inside, the mansion was a tomb. The body of Caleb lay in the hall, his neck broken with the same silent efficiency as the others. But it was the study that drew them, the heart of Thorne's power. They gathered at the doorway, peering into the gloom. What they saw there would become the core of a legend, a story told in hushed tones for 100 years. Elias Thorne was not there, not in any recognizable form. The man who had considered himself a god had been, as the story would later say, deconstructed. His parts were arranged on the floor with a terrifying, almost artistic precision. It was not the work of rage. Rage is messy. This was the work of something far colder, something that saw a complex machine and decided to see how it worked by taking it apart, piece by piece. It was an act of absolute and total negation. In the face of this silent, methodical annihilation, the slaves felt a terror that was quickly replaced by a profound, earth-shattering awe. The curse they had feared had become their salvation. The monsters in the darkness had been their angels of liberation all along. As the sun climbed higher, Anya and her 5 daughters emerged from the mansion. They were not splattered with blood or filled with the fire of vengeance. They were exactly as they always were, silent, placid, their faces unreadable, but their role had changed. They were no longer outcasts. They were leaders. The people of Blackwood, a community of souls who had known nothing but bondage, turned their faces to these 6 giants, their eyes asking the question, "What now?" The answer was not what any of them expected. Anya did not point them north, toward the uncertain promise of the free states and the gauntlet of slave catchers that lay between. She turned and pointed south, deeper into the swamp, into the wild, untamed heart of the bayou that had been her ally. It was a declaration. They would not run from this place. They would claim it. They would take the one piece of land the masters had never been able to tame and make it their own. It was an exodus not of escape, but of conquest. That morning, the entire population of Blackwood Manor, men, women, and children, gathered what little they had and followed their silent saviors into the cypress groves. They walked away from the sugarcane fields, away from the whip, away from the memory of Elias Thorne. They walked into the shadows of the swamp not as fugitives, but as pioneers of a new, hidden nation, a kingdom of the dispossessed, ruled by a silent queen and her 5 fearsome princesses. Years passed. The Civil War raged across the South, tearing the old world apart. Union patrols, pushing deep into the Louisiana bayous, began to hear strange stories from the locals and from the escaped slaves they encountered. They spoke of a phantom community hidden deep in the swamps, a place called Anya's Rest, or sometimes the Silent Kingdom. They said it was a sanctuary for runaways, protected by a tribe of guardians unlike any the soldiers had ever imagined. Stories described a family of giant women, impossibly tall and strong, who moved through the swamps like ghosts. They felt no pain, they had no fear, and they guarded their territory with a brutal, silent efficiency. Confederate patrols that ventured too deep into that territory simply vanished, leaving behind only broken equipment and bodies that looked as if they had fallen from a great height. No one knew if the stories were true. No official report ever confirmed the existence of this hidden community. But the legend persisted, becoming a part of the local folklore. The tale of the silent giants of Blackwood Swamp became a story of hope for the oppressed and a terrifying ghost story for those who would do them harm. Anya and her daughters had transcended their own history. They were no longer just the survivors of a madman's experiment. They had become a myth, a powerful symbol of a resistance so absolute that it had carved out its own sovereign space in the heart of its enemy's land. In the end, the story of Anya is not about a curse or a medical anomaly. It is about pain. It is a story that forces us to consider the nature of suffering on a scale that is almost impossible to comprehend. What happens to the human soul when it is subjected to a pain so total, so relentless, that it becomes the only reality? Perhaps the body, in a last, desperate act of self-preservation, simply learns to forget. Perhaps Anya's flesh forgot how to feel a needle prick or a whip's lash because her spirit was already screaming from a wound that would never heal. Her condition was not an absence of feeling. It was a feeling so immense it overloaded every circuit, forcing a system shutdown. She was a physical manifestation of the psychic agony of slavery itself, a body that had to stop feeling physical pain because the emotional and spiritual torment was already consuming everything. She and her daughters were not monsters. They were a terrible and necessary adaptation. They were what happens when you try to breed a human being like an animal, and the human spirit, in its infinite and terrifying resilience, breeds something new in response, something stronger, something colder, something that can endure the unendurable and then, when the time is right, turn the tools of its own oppression into instruments of a final, silent, and absolute justice. Today, the ruins of Blackwood Manor are little more than a pile of bricks and rotted timbers, slowly being swallowed by the Louisiana swamp. The land is said to be haunted, a place where the air is still heavy with the memory of an unspeakable horror and an even more terrifying reckoning. But what is the true nature of this story? Is it a forgotten chapter of history, pieced together from a madman's journal and the whispers of a forgotten people? Or is it a legend, a necessary myth created to give a face to the righteous, silent rage of the enslaved? Was Anya a real woman, or was she the vengeful ghost of every soul that suffered and died in the sugarcane fields? Perhaps the answer doesn't matter. What matters is the truth the story holds, that there is a breaking point beyond which the oppressed will not bend, but will instead become something new, something the oppressor can no longer understand or control. What are your theories? Do you believe a community like Anya's Rest could have truly existed? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this journey into the dark corners of history chilled you to the bone, please support our channel by hitting the like button, sharing this video, and subscribing to the Sealed Room for more forbidden history. We will see you in the next investigation.